This is the Proactive Mindfulness podcast with Serge Prangle. This episode is for therapists. I will be talking about what it takes to make therapy work, the process that's called memory reconsolidation, and what it takes to create conditions where deep, lasting change becomes possible. So, here I'm going to be talking about what makes therapy work. And maybe a good way to start is what doesn't. And insight by itself doesn't. So, we all know that many therapy clients can speak at length about their history. They can describe their patterns. They can even identify the origins of their difficulty. In other words, they understand themselves very well, but they remain stuck. So, very clearly, that insight by itself is not what produces change. Something does not shift simply because it has been named or explained. So, what is it that makes change happen? Well, there has to be an experience that touches you deeply enough that things are no longer quite the same after that experience. And this is what I want to talk about today. It's a process that is often called memory reconsolidation. Seems like a mouthful. The phrase comes from neuroscience. So neuroscience talk about memory because that's what they study. They pay attention to how memories are stored and how neural connections can be updated. So the phrase memory reconsolidation points to a reconfiguration at the level of the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a therapist. And so for me, there's another phrase that's more evocative of what we do, and also for clients. So that phrase is corrective emotional experience. I'm going to be talking more about this, but first, I want to put all of this within a larger context. And that context is that living beings are built to adapt. So, what's that? Well, we don't exist in a void. We exist in interaction. We need air, we need food, we need contact. And interaction also brings friction. So there are problems, there are demands, there are challenges. The entire history of life can be seen as a history of adaptation to having our needs met and dealing with challenges. At the scale of the species, we call that evolution. At the scale of a lifetime, we call it development. And at the scale of a single day, that's the constant work of adjusting to whatever we encounter, consciously and mostly unconscious. And so, something we often talk about when we talk about clients is how they or us develop coping mechanisms. And coping mechanisms, I want to put them into the context of this adaptive process. You could define coping mechanisms as improvised solutions to the real problems we encounter. So, to develop a coping mechanism, we use whatever internal and external resources are available at the time. And coping mechanisms work, at least somewhat, at least for some time. So the word does not necessarily imply pathology. I like to think of them as attempts to adapt. Where the difficulty begins is when the pattern becomes rigid. So, what once was a solution in one context gets carried forward into context where it no longer fits. And if nothing in the person's experience challenges that pattern, there is no reason for it to change. By default, we keep doing what we have learned to do. Now, what do we do with it? When a maladaptive pattern persists, it's not very helpful to say that the person is stuck or broken. That framing doesn't move toward change. What opens new horizons is recognizing that the person has not yet had an experience strong enough or deep enough to update the pattern. And so, how does this make change happen? Well, a corrective experience disproves an assumption that you had previously made about yourself or about the world. It opens a new possibility for functioning. So let's take the example of somebody who carries the conviction implicitly that I will inevitably fail. Now, there's a new experience that contradicts that. Not in theory, not thoughts, not just convincing people through theories, but in the lived reality of this person. So when that contradiction is experienced, it opens a new possibility. We're not talking about going from I will inevitably fail to I am sure to always succeed. We're talking about I now have a shot at it. And that is a big change. Again, you cannot reach that level simply by discussing ideas. Conceptual understanding is not enough. The experience has to reach you at a gut level. It has to disrupt the old model of the world that was formed under pressure of the challenges way back when. I sometimes think of it this way. If iron has been forged into a particular shape, you cannot reshape it unless you first heat it enough to soften it. So the structure has to loosen before it can take on a new form. Now, there is a complicating factor, and it is that safety is necessary. Without safety, any disruption or challenge simply triggers shutdown, avoidance, re-traumatization. Nothing useful happens under these conditions. So safety is not optional. At the same time, safety by itself is not sufficient. If therapy offers warmth, acceptance, consistent relationship, but never includes a genuine emotional encounter, a challenge, then the old pattern has no reason to revise itself. The person may feel better, they may develop valuable insights about their history, their psychology, but the underlying pattern will probably remain intact. So, what is required is both safety and challenge. There needs to be a safe enough environment, and within it, a real contact with the emotion that lies at the root of the pattern. And so I want to say this: emotion is not the enemy of therapeutic work, it is the entry point. If we stay at the level of talking about experience, therapy can remain there indefinitely. It can become a conversation about life rather than a lived experience in the present moment. And in that case, the kind of structural change that people are seeking may not happen. So, what does emotion actually do in this process? What makes emotion important is not that it makes a session feel intense or meaningful. It is important because emotion is the driver for adaptation. Emotion is what moves you to action. So let's talk more about emotion. Behind many maladaptive patterns, there is fear. The pattern was originally created in response to a perceived danger. It persists because the fear persists. From the client's perspective, at a gut level, the pattern has emotional logic. It is a response to a signal that says the situation is dangerous. And so the pattern functions as a way of avoiding danger. For the therapist, this has practical implications. The rigidity, the avoidance, the self-protection that we see in a client are not obstacles to overcome. They are information. They point toward what is being protected and why. Our task is not to convince the client that the danger is an illusion. It is to create conditions in which the client can encounter the fear in a new way, in a context that is sufficiently different from the original situation to allow for new learning. When that takes place, change can happen. The emotional charge that has been held around a memory or a pattern is activated. But this time, it is met with something that does not confirm the original fear. It contradicts it. In that moment, the implicit learning can shift. And this shift is not an abstraction. As the client, you experience it as a bodily felt sense. From the outside, as the therapist, you can track bodily manifestations of the shift. Something loosens, something settles. There may be a sigh. These are external manifestations of the felt shift in the client. The earlier events that had led to creative and maladaptive patterns are not erased from memory. What changes is the charge around situations that echo these earlier events. The sense of ongoing danger diminishes. The nervous system no longer has to mobilize in the same way. So, what is the therapist's role in this process? Well, we're not robots carrying out a technical procedure called memory reconsolidation. We're human beings, and our role is to build an environment in which a natural updating process can occur. I think of it as an ecosystem that fosters the natural process of adapting. And to talk more about this ecosystem, it has two qualities that must coexist. There must be enough challenge to create the possibility of a disruption of rigid patterns. And there must be enough safety for the client to remain present and engaged. The point of the safety is to give the client enough space to feel the emotion rather than bounce away from it. Only then can the client learn at a gut level that the situation can have a different outcome, despite what the emotion is signaling. This can be difficult for us therapists. When something becomes emotionally charged, we may very well feel the impulse to relieve the tension, to normalize, to reassure, or to redirect. Of course, it is often appropriate to shield clients from very intense experiences. But sometimes the shielding results in missing the moment when staying with the experience would allow something new to emerge. And so it is useful for us to examine whether our tendency to shield clients from intensity might have to do with our own discomfort with intensity. Now, I'm not advocating for turning therapy into a boot camp or some kind of extreme sport. For one thing, not every client comes with us seeking transformational change. Some come to us to process events, to be witness, or to think aloud in the presence of another person. And even for those clients who seek deep change, we should err on the side of safety rather than pushing too much too soon. With all these caveats in mind, we need to keep our eyes on what makes the process of change work. It doesn't happen by just talking about experience. It happens through experiencing. Experiencing in real time something that contradicts the old expectation. Now, how does this work out, in practice? It comes down to tracking moment by moment experience, the client's as well as our own. We do this to monitor safety and adjust as needed, walking the fine line between safety and complacency, between safety and complacency. Reminding ourselves that the ecosystem we want to foster is not the absence of challenge, but a challenge that the client can manage. Keeping our focus on tracking moment by moment experience keeps us focused on the ongoing process. Not just the words, but the music. The embodied process it shows up through any subtle bodily manifestation. This is how we notice that something is shifting. We keep reminding ourselves that we are in the midst of a living process, even when it feels like nothing much is happening. We refocus on tracking whatever may be happening ever so subtly. And that includes, at times, the heavy stillness of the space, because that is the form that the living process is taking here and now. A very simple way to do this is to voice that we are slowing down, pausing, taking a moment to take in the situation. Words to that effect. Simple words that validate staying with the not knowing, with the uncomfortable feelings, and giving that a chance to shift organically. This helps both therapist and client stay engaged with the process of change as it unfolds. If we expect the process of change to happen with a big drum roll, well, we're likely to miss it. Instead, we cultivate our ability to stay in tune with the subtleties of embodied experience. And this is how we may recognize change as it happens. And that's how momentum builds for change, moment by moment. This recording is part of the Proactive Mindfulness podcast, where we explore the process of mindful change. You can find more articles and videos on the website proactivemindfulness.com.